Margaret Chen stood in front of her bathroom mirror, applying lipstick with a trembling hand. The invitation to the Harrison family's annual summer party sat on the counter, its gold lettering mocking her with every glance. She had tried to decline politely, but her daughter Emily had insisted. It had been 3 years since Margaret had attended any social gathering, and Emily thought it was time for her mother to rejoin the world. The evening air was warm as Margaret walked up the stone pathway to the Harrison mansion. String lights decorated the garden, and the sound of laughter and clinking glasses drifted through the open windows. She clutched her small purse tighter, fighting the urge to turn around and go home. Through the grand entrance, she could see familiar faces from the neighborhood, people she had once known well but had avoided since the accident. Inside, the party was already in full swing. Margaret recognized Dr. Harrison immediately, his booming voice carrying across the room as he told stories to a captivated audience. His wife, Patricia, glided between guests with the grace of a seasoned hostess. The house was magnificent, with marble floors and crystal chandeliers that sparkled like stars. In the corner of the main living room sat a beautiful grand piano, its black surface gleaming under the lights. Margaret felt her chest tighten at the sight of it. She quickly looked away, focusing instead on finding a quiet corner where she could blend into the background. She accepted a glass of champagne from a passing waiter and made her way to a spot near the large bay windows overlooking the garden. "Margaret? Margaret Chen? Is that really you?" A woman's voice cut through the ambient noise. Margaret turned to see Linda Morrison approaching, her face bright with surprise. Linda had been part of the same social circle years ago, back when Margaret was still performing. "Hello, Linda," Margaret managed a small smile. "It's been a while." "A while?" "It's been years. I heard about what happened, of course. Such a terrible thing. How are your hands now?" Linda's eyes immediately dropped to Margaret's hands, and Margaret instinctively pulled them closer to her body. "They're fine. I manage," Margaret said shortly, hoping to end the conversation. But Linda continued, her voice taking on a tone of exaggerated sympathy. "I still remember your concerts at the Symphony Hall. You were absolutely brilliant. Such a shame about the accident. Do you still play at all?" "No," Margaret replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not anymore." Before Linda could press further, Dr. Harrison's voice boomed across the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention, please." The crowd quieted down, turning toward their host. "As many of you know, Patricia and I love to make our summer parties memorable. This year we have a special treat. Our dear friend James Wu has agreed to play a few pieces for us on the piano." Applause broke out as a distinguished-looking man in his 60s stood up from one of the sofas. Margaret recognized him immediately. James Wu was a respected amateur pianist in their community, known for his technically correct but emotionally distant performances. She had performed alongside him at charity events years ago. James took his seat at the piano with practiced ease and launched into a Chopin nocturne. The notes were precise, every rhythm exact, but Margaret could hear the lack of soul in the performance. It was music played by someone who had learned all the right movements, but had never truly felt the emotion behind the composition. Still, the guests listened politely, and when he finished, they offered generous applause. "Marvelous, simply marvelous," Dr. Harrison declared. "James, you've outdone yourself. Anyone else want to try their hand at our beautiful instrument?" Several guests laughed and shook their heads. "Oh no, we couldn't possibly follow that," one woman said. Others murmured their agreement, content to remain in their safe roles as listeners rather than performers. Margaret sipped her champagne and tried to make herself invisible. She could feel Linda's eyes on her, and she knew what was coming. Sure enough, Linda's voice rang out clearly. "What about you, Margaret? You used to play beautifully. Why don't you show us what you can still do?" The room fell silent. All eyes turned to Margaret, who felt her face flush hot with embarrassment. She shook her head quickly. "No, thank you. I don't play anymore." "Oh, come on," Linda pressed, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "Surely you remember something. It would be nice to hear you again after all these years." "I really can't," Margaret insisted, her voice firmer now. "My hands aren't what they used to be." Dr. Harrison, sensing the tension, tried to move the conversation along. "Well, if Margaret doesn't feel comfortable, we certainly won't force her. Music should always be a joy, never an obligation." But the damage was done. Margaret could hear whispers starting around the room. She caught fragments of conversation floating past her ears. Such a shame. Used to be so talented. The car accident. Nerve damage. Each word felt like a small cut. Linda leaned in closer, her voice pitched low enough that only Margaret could hear. I didn't mean to embarrass you. I just thought maybe you had recovered by now. It's been 3 years after all. Margaret set down her champagne glass with more force than intended. Some things don't fully recover, Linda. Some losses are permanent. She excused herself and made her way toward the bathroom, needing a moment alone to compose herself. As she walked through the hallway, she passed a group of younger guests who were talking and laughing. She overheard one of them say, "Did you see that awkward moment with the woman who used to play piano?" Harrison really should screen his guest list better. The words stung more than Margaret wanted to admit. She locked herself in the bathroom and stared at her reflection again. Her hands, which had once flown across piano keys with the grace and speed of a dancer, now bore the evidence of extensive reconstructive surgery. The scars were faded but still visible, thin white lines that crisscrossed her fingers and palms. She could move them, could grip things and perform daily tasks, but the precision required for professional piano playing was gone. 3 years of physical therapy had helped her regain basic function, but the dream of performing again had died in the same accident that had shattered her hands. Margaret took several deep breaths, trying to calm the storm of emotions swirling inside her. She had known coming to this party was a mistake. She should have trusted her instincts and stayed home. When Margaret finally emerged from the bathroom, she decided to leave. She would make a quick excuse to Emily later, blame it on a headache or fatigue. As she made her way toward the front entrance, she nearly collided with a young woman carrying a tray of desserts. "Oh, I'm so sorry," the young woman said, steadying the tray. She was perhaps in her mid-20s, with kind eyes and a warm smile. Her name tag read Sophia. "No, it was my fault. I wasn't watching where I was going," Margaret replied. Sophia studied Margaret's face for a moment. "You look upset. Are you all right?" There was something genuine in the question that made Margaret pause. "I'm fine. Just ready to go home." "I don't blame you," Sophia said quietly, glancing back toward the main room. "Some of these people can be quite cruel without even realizing it. I heard what happened in there. That woman shouldn't have put you on the spot like that." Margaret was surprised. "You heard?" "I was refilling the drinks table nearby. For what it's worth, I think you handled it with grace." Sophia shifted the tray to one hand and extended the other. "I'm Sophia Martinez. I work for the catering company, but I'm actually a music student at the conservatory." Margaret shook her hand gently. "Margaret Chun. I used to teach at the conservatory, actually." "Many years ago." Sophia's eyes widened. "Wait, Margaret Chun. The Margaret Chun? I've studied your recordings. Your interpretation of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 is legendary among the students. Professor Williams plays it for us at least once a semester." For the first time that evening, Margaret felt a small spark of warmth. That was a long time ago. A different lifetime. "Your technique was incredible," Sophia continued, her enthusiasm bubbling over. "The way you could make the piano sing. It wasn't just playing notes, it was telling a story. You made people feel things." Margaret felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes. "Thank you. That means more than you know." Sophia glanced around, then lowered her voice. "Can I ask what happened? Everyone says there was an accident, but no one seems to know the details." Margaret hesitated. She rarely talked about that night, but something about Sophia's genuine interest made her want to share. "I was driving home from a concert. It was raining heavily and a truck ran a red light. My car was hit on the driver's side. The impact crushed my hands against the steering wheel and dashboard. The doctors said I was lucky to keep my hands at all, but the nerve damage was extensive." "I can't imagine how devastating that must have been," Sophia said softly. "The physical pain was nothing compared to losing my ability to play," Margaret admitted. "Music was my whole life. Without it, I felt like I had lost my purpose." Sophia was quiet for a moment, then said something unexpected. "But you haven't lost your knowledge or your understanding of music. That's still inside you, isn't it?" Margaret had never thought of it that way. I suppose so, but what good is knowledge if you can't apply it? You could teach, Sophia suggested. Share what you know with people like me who are desperate to learn from someone who truly understands music at that level. Before Margaret could respond, Dr. Harrison's voice called out again from the main room. Sophia, we need more champagne out here. I have to go, Sophia said apologetically. But please, think about what I said. The world needs your gifts, even if they come in a different form now. She hurried off with her tray, leaving Margaret standing alone in the hallway. Margaret decided to stay a bit longer. She returned to the main room and found a seat in the back, observing the party from a safe distance. James Wu was at the piano again, this time playing a Mozart sonata. The technical execution was flawless, but Margaret could hear where he was missing the nuance, where the music called for subtlety that he wasn't providing. As she listened, Margaret found herself mentally correcting his interpretation, imagining how she would have approached certain passages differently. Her fingers twitched slightly, muscle memory responding to the music even though she could no longer play it herself. A portly man she didn't recognize sat down in the chair next to her. Beautiful, isn't it? He said, gesturing toward the piano. It's competent, Margaret replied honestly. The man chuckled. A critic, I see. Are you a musician yourself? I was once upon a time. What stopped you? Margaret held up her hands, letting him see the scars in the soft light. Life happened. The man nodded sympathetically. I'm sorry to hear that. I'm Robert, by the way. Robert Fisher. I'm a music producer, actually. I work with young artists, helping them develop their sound and find their voice in the industry. They talked for a while about music, about the changing landscape of classical performance, about the new generation of musicians coming up through the conservatories. Robert was easy to talk to, and Margaret found herself relaxing for the first time all evening. You know, Robert said thoughtfully, some of the best teachers I've ever met were performers who had to stop performing. They understand things that people who've never been on that level can't possibly grasp. It was the second time that evening someone had suggested teaching. Margaret wondered if the universe was trying to tell her something. As the evening wore on, more guests attempted to play the piano. Most were amateurs who knew a few simple pieces, and they played with enthusiasm if not skill. The crowd was generous with their applause, treating each performance as entertainment rather than serious music. Then Linda Morrison stood up, slightly tipsy from the champagne. I'll play something, she announced to general laughter and encouragement. She made her way to the piano unsteadily and sat down heavily on the bench. What followed was a massacre of Beethoven's Far Elise. Linda's fingers stumbled over the keys, missing notes and losing tempo constantly. She laughed at her own mistakes, treating the whole thing as a joke. When she finished, people clapped politely, more for her courage than her ability. As Linda stood up from the piano, she looked directly at Margaret. See, it's not so hard. Even I can do it, and I've never had a single lesson. You really should try, Margaret. Show us what a real pianist sounds like, even with damaged hands. The comment was meant to sound encouraging, but it came across as patronizing and cruel. Margaret felt the familiar burn of humiliation rising in her chest. Several people turned to look at her, waiting to see how she would respond. Margaret stood up slowly, her heart pounding. No, thank you, Linda. I think you've provided enough entertainment for one evening. The words came out sharper than she intended, and Linda's smile faltered. An uncomfortable silence fell over the room. Dr. Harrison tried to smooth things over by suggesting they all move to the garden for dessert, and most of the guests gratefully took the opportunity to change the scene. Margaret remained in her seat, alone in the main room except for Sophia, who had come in to clear away empty glasses. The young woman approached Margaret quietly. That woman is insufferable, Sophia said quietly as she collected glasses. She has no idea what she's talking about. Margaret managed a weak smile. She's harmless. Just thoughtless. There's a difference between being thoughtless and being cruel, Sophia countered. What she did was cruel. Margaret watched through the bay windows as the party guests mingled in the garden, their laughter carrying on the evening breeze. They had already forgotten the uncomfortable moment, moved on to other topics and other amusements. But Margaret couldn't forget. The humiliation sat heavy in her stomach. Can I tell you something? Sophia asked, sitting down in the chair Robert had vacated earlier. When I first started at the conservatory, I was so excited. I thought I was going to become this great pianist, perform in concert halls around the world. But after a few months, I realized I was just average. There were students half my age who could play circles around me. It was devastating. Margaret looked at the young woman with new understanding. What did you do? I almost quit, Sophia admitted. But then one of my professors said something that changed my perspective. He said that not everyone is meant to be a soloist, but that doesn't make their contribution to music any less valuable. Some people are meant to teach. Some are meant to compose. Some are meant to bring music to communities that wouldn't otherwise have access to it. Music is bigger than any one person's ambition. That's very wise, Margaret said. The point is, Sophia continued, you don't have to be performing on stage to matter in the world of music. Your knowledge, your experience, your understanding of what makes music transcendent, that has value. Those guests out there, laughing and drinking, they'll never understand what it means to truly love music the way you do. But there are people who would give anything to learn from someone like you. Before Margaret could respond, Emily appeared in the doorway. Her daughter looked concerned, her eyes scanning the room until they found Margaret. Mom, I've been looking everywhere for you. Are you okay? Someone said there was an incident. Margaret stood up, smoothing her dress. I'm fine, sweetheart. Just some awkwardness with Linda Morrison. Nothing I couldn't handle. Emily approached and took her mother's hands gently, examining them with a practiced eye. She was a nurse, and she had been Margaret's primary caretaker during the long recovery period after the accident. Did someone say something about your hands? It's nothing, really. Let's just enjoy the rest of the party. But Emily wasn't convinced. She turned to Sophia, who was pretending to be busy with her cleaning. What happened? Sophia glanced at Margaret, who gave a small nod of permission. A guest kept pressuring your mother to play the piano, even after she politely declined. It was inappropriate. Emily's jaw tightened. Let me guess. Linda Morrison. You know her? Margaret asked. Unfortunately. She's on the hospital board where I work. She's always putting her foot in her mouth. Emily squeezed her mother's hands gently. I'm sorry, Mom. I shouldn't have pushed you to come tonight. Don't apologize, Margaret said firmly. I'm glad I came. I've had some interesting conversations, and I've been thinking about things I haven't thought about in a long time. Out in the garden, Dr. Harrison was making another announcement. The three women could hear his voice calling everyone to gather around. Curious, they made their way to the French doors that opened onto the patio. Dr. Harrison stood on the raised garden platform, holding a glass of champagne. Before the evening gets too late, Patricia and I wanted to make a special announcement. As many of you know, we've been working on establishing a music education program for underprivileged children in our community. We're proud to announce that the Harrison Foundation will be funding a new music center downtown, offering free lessons to children who otherwise wouldn't have access to musical education. The crowd applauded enthusiastically. Patricia Harrison stepped forward, her elegant dress shimmering in the garden lights. We're looking for experienced musicians who would be willing to volunteer their time as instructors. We want to give these children the same opportunities that many of us had growing up. If anyone is interested, please see me before you leave tonight. Margaret felt Emily's hand tighten on her arm. Mom, you should do it. What? No, I couldn't possibly. Why not? You've been looking for something to give your life purpose again. This could be it. Margaret shook her head. Emily, I haven't taught in years. And these children need someone who can demonstrate, who can show them proper technique. You can still do that, Emily insisted. Your hands may not be able to perform at a professional level anymore, but you can still play well enough to teach beginners. And more importantly, you have the knowledge and passion that these kids need. Sophia, who had followed them to the doorway, spoke up. She's right, you know. Teaching isn't just about physical demonstration. It's about understanding music deeply enough to help others find their own connection to it. Margaret looked at the two young women flanking her, both so earnest in their belief that she still had something to offer. For 3 years, she had defined herself by what she had lost. But standing here now, she began to wonder if maybe there was another way to look at her situation. I'll think about it, she said finally, and Emily beamed. The party continued for another hour. Margaret stayed, no longer hiding in corners but engaging in conversations, reconnecting with people she had avoided for too long. She spoke with Patricia Harrison about the music center and left her contact information, making no promises but not closing the door either. As guests began to leave, Margaret found herself standing alone in front of the grand piano once more. The room was empty, most people having moved to the foyer to say their goodbyes. She approached the instrument slowly, as if it were a wild animal that might bolt if she moved too quickly. Margaret sat down on the bench, feeling the familiar smoothness of the wood beneath her. She placed her hands on the keys, not pressing down, just resting them there. The sensation brought tears to her eyes, memories flooding back of countless hours spent at pianos just like this one, of performances and practice sessions, of the pure joy that music had once brought her. She pressed down gently on middle C, the note rang out clear and true in the empty room. Then she tried a simple scale, her fingers moving slowly, carefully. The muscle memory was still there, buried beneath the scar tissue and the fear. Her hands ached a bit from the movement, but she could do it. It wasn't perfect, it would never be perfect again, but it was something. Linda Morrison appeared in the doorway, having returned from the garden. She saw Margaret at the piano and smiled, an expression that didn't quite reach her eyes. Finally decided to play something after all? Margaret removed her hands from the keys and stood up. Just saying goodbye to an old friend. Such a shame about your career, Linda said, her tone dripping with false sympathy. You were really quite good, from what I remember. But I suppose we all have to face our limitations eventually. The words stung, but Margaret refused to let Linda see her flinch. We all have different paths to walk, Linda. Mine just took an unexpected turn. Well, at least you have your memories, Linda continued, picking up a champagne glass from a nearby table. I always thought it must be terrible to have had such talent and then lose it. Like knowing what you're missing, you know? Sometimes I think it would be easier to never have had it at all. Something inside Margaret shifted. The comment was meant to be cutting, to diminish her, but instead it crystallized something she had been feeling all evening. Actually, Linda, I disagree. Having experienced that level of connection with music, even if I can't perform it anymore, is better than never having experienced it at all. I know what it means to make a piano sing. I understand the soul of music in a way that most people never will. That's not something I've lost. That's something I'll always have. Linda blinked, clearly not expecting that response. Well, good for you, I suppose. Emily appeared then, ready to take her mother home. As they walked to the car, Margaret felt lighter than she had in months. The evening had been difficult, uncomfortable at times, but it had also awakened something in her that had been dormant for too long. Over the next few days, Margaret couldn't stop thinking about the music center. She found herself researching teaching methods for children, watching videos of music education programs, remembering the joy she used to feel when she occasionally taught master classes at the conservatory. On Thursday morning, she called Patricia Harrison. Margaret, how wonderful to hear from you, Patricia said warmly. I was hoping you might reach out. I'd like to learn more about the volunteer teaching positions, Margaret said, her voice steady despite her nervousness. They met for coffee that afternoon. Patricia explained the vision for the center, how they wanted to provide not just technical instruction, but to foster a genuine love of music in children, who might never have the opportunity otherwise. We're not looking for teachers who want to create concert pianists, Patricia explained. We're looking for people who can inspire a love of music, who can show these children that music can be a source of joy and expression in their lives. That's a beautiful vision, Margaret said. Would you consider joining us? We would be honored to have someone with your background and experience. Margaret hesitated. I need to be honest with you, Patricia. I haven't taught in years, and my hands aren't what they used to be. I can play, but not at the level I once did. Patricia reached across the table and touched Margaret's hand gently. I'm not asking you to perform, Margaret. I'm asking you to teach. There's a difference. These children need someone who understands music from the inside, who knows what it means to pour your heart into an instrument. That's what you can give them. Margaret agreed to start with a trial period, teaching twice a week for 2 hours each session. The music center wouldn't officially open for another month, but Patricia wanted Margaret to begin planning her curriculum and getting familiar with the space. When Margaret told Emily, her daughter hugged her tightly. I'm so proud of you, Mom. This is exactly what you needed. The next few weeks passed in a blur of preparation. Margaret threw herself into creating lesson plans, selecting appropriate music for beginners, and remembering what it felt like to be passionate about something again. She visited the music center, a renovated warehouse that had been transformed into a bright, welcoming space with practice rooms and a main studio containing several keyboards and 2 upright pianos. But as the start date approached, Margaret's anxiety grew. What if she couldn't do this? What if her hands failed her in front of the students? What if she had forgotten how to teach? The doubts circled in her mind like vultures, picking at her confidence. The night before her first class, Margaret couldn't sleep. She got up at 2 in the morning and made tea, sitting at her kitchen table and staring at her hands in the dim light. They looked ordinary, just hands, but they carried so much weight, so much history. Her phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Sophia, the young woman from the party. They had exchanged numbers that evening, and Sophia had checked in a few times since then. Can't sleep? First day jitters? The message read. Margaret smiled and typed back. How did you know? Because I'm the same way before any performance or important event. Want some advice from someone who's been taught by some tough teachers? Please. Remember that teaching isn't about being perfect. It's about being authentic. Those kids don't need you to be the pianist you used to be. They need you to be the teacher you are right now. Trust yourself. Margaret read the message several times, letting the words sink in. Sophia was right. She had been so focused on what she had lost that she hadn't fully embraced what she still had to offer. The next morning, Margaret arrived at the music center an hour early. She walked through the empty space, familiarizing herself with every corner. She sat at the piano in the main studio and played through some simple exercises, warming up her hands and her confidence. At exactly 4 o'clock, the first students arrived. There were 8 of them, ranging in age from 7 to 12. They came from different backgrounds, different neighborhoods, but they all shared one thing in common: a curiosity about music and an eagerness to learn. Margaret introduced herself, keeping it simple. My name is Margaret Chen, and I'm going to be your piano teacher. I used to perform professionally, but I had an accident that changed my path. Now I'm here to share what I know with you. Does anyone have any questions before we begin? A small boy with thick glasses raised his hand. What happened in your accident? Margaret appreciated his directness. She held up her hands, showing them the scars. I was in a car crash and my hands were badly injured. The doctors fixed them as best they could, but I can't play the way I used to. But you know what? That's okay. Because I can still play well enough to teach you, and I can still hear music the way I always have. The music is up here, she tapped her head. And in here, she placed her hand over her heart. The hands are just the tools we use to let it out. The children seemed satisfied with that answer. They were young enough not to see her limitations as tragic, just as facts to be accepted and moved past. The first lesson was basic but essential. Margaret taught them about posture, hand position, how to sit at the piano properly. She demonstrated simple finger exercises, playing slowly so they could see exactly what she was doing. Her hands ached a bit, but they did what she needed them to do. Then she had each child come up to the piano individually and try the exercises themselves. She stood beside them, gently correcting their hand positions, encouraging them, showing them how to curve their fingers just right. With each child, she felt a little bit of the old joy returning. This was different from performing, but it was meaningful in its own way. By the end of the 2-hour session, all 8 children could play a simple 5-note scale. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning. As they filed out, chattering excitedly to their parents about what they had learned, Margaret felt a warmth spreading through her chest. She had done it. She had taught her first class in 3 years, and it had gone well. Over the next few weeks, Margaret fell into a rhythm. Tuesday and Thursday afternoons were dedicated to her students at the music center. She watched them progress from simple scales to basic melodies, and their enthusiasm was infectious. They didn't see her as a failed performer or someone to be pitied. They saw her as their teacher, someone who was opening up a new world for them. One of her students, a 9-year-old girl named Jasmine, showed particular promise. She had a natural feel for rhythm and intuitive understanding of melody. Margaret found herself spending extra time with Jasmine, nurturing her talent, seeing glimpses of herself at that age. But teaching at the music center also meant facing the reality of her limitations more directly. Sometimes her hands would ache so badly after a session that she had to ice them for an hour. Occasionally she would try to demonstrate a more complex technique, and find that her fingers couldn't quite execute it the way they once had. Those moments were frustrating, even heartbreaking at times. One Thursday evening, as she was packing up her things after class, Patricia Harrison stopped by the center. "Margaret, do you have a moment?" "Of course," Margaret said, setting down her bag. Patricia settled into one of the chairs in the main studio. "I wanted to check in with you. How are you finding the teaching?" "It's been wonderful," Margaret said honestly. "Challenging but wonderful. The children are making real progress." "They love you," Patricia said with a smile. "I've heard from several parents about how excited their kids are about piano lessons. You have a gift for making it accessible and fun." "Thank you. That means a lot." Patricia hesitated, then continued. "I also wanted to mention something. The Harrison Foundation is planning a fundraising gala in 2 months. We're hoping to raise money to expand the Music Center program to include other instruments. We'd like to showcase some of the work being done here, maybe have some of the students perform, and also feature some of our volunteer teachers." Margaret felt her stomach drop. "Feature the teachers how?" "We were hoping you might be willing to play something," Patricia said gently. "Nothing elaborate, just a short piece. People who donate to the foundation would love to hear from someone with your background. It would be very inspiring." "Patricia, I don't perform anymore." "You know that." "I know you're not performing at concert halls anymore," Patricia clarified. "But this would be different. It would be intimate, supportive. You wouldn't be performing for critics or recording artists. You'd be playing for people who believe in what we're doing here and want to support it." Margaret shook her head. "I appreciate the thought, but no. I'm not ready for that. I may never be ready for that." "I understand," Patricia said, though Margaret could see the disappointment in her eyes. "The offer stands if you change your mind, but there's no pressure." That night, Margaret lay in bed thinking about Patricia's request. The idea of performing again, even in a small, supportive setting, terrified her. She had avoided playing in front of anyone except her students for 3 years. The thought of sitting at a piano in front of a room full of people, exposing her limitations, her scars, her reduced abilities, it was too much. But a small voice in the back of her mind whispered that maybe Patricia was right. Maybe it would be different this time. Maybe she could do it. She pushed the thought away and tried to sleep. The weeks passed, and Margaret's students continued to improve. She had expanded her classes to include a beginners group and an intermediate group. The intermediate students, which included Jasmine and 3 others who had shown particular dedication, were working on their first real pieces now, simple arrangements of folk songs and classical melodies. During one class, Jasmine asked Margaret a question that caught her off guard. "Miss Chen, why did you stop performing? I mean, even if your hands aren't perfect, you can still play really well." "I've heard you." The other students looked up, curious. Margaret sat down at the piano bench and thought about how to answer. When you're a professional performer, people expect a certain level of excellence. After my accident, I couldn't meet that expectation anymore. It wasn't about playing well, it was about playing perfectly. And I couldn't do that. "But you always tell us that music isn't about being perfect," another student, a boy named Marcus, pointed out. "You say it's about expressing feelings and telling stories." Margaret smiled at having her own words reflected back at her. "You're absolutely right, Marcus. I do say that. Maybe I need to start listening to my own advice." That conversation stayed with Margaret. She found herself thinking about the gala again, about Patricia's invitation. Maybe it was time to face her fear. Maybe it was time to step out from behind the safety of teaching and be vulnerable again. She called Patricia the next day. "I've been thinking about the gala. I might be willing to play something, but I have conditions." "Name them," Patricia said. "It has to be something I choose, something I feel confident about. And I need time to prepare properly. My hands need to be conditioned slowly." "Of course. You have complete creative control." "The gala is still 6 weeks away. Is that enough time?" "It will have to be," Margaret said, her heart pounding. After hanging up, Margaret sat at her home piano and began to think about what she could play. It needed to be something meaningful, something that showcased musicality rather than technical flash. It needed to be honest. She began working through possibilities, playing through pieces she used to know by heart. Some were too technically demanding for her current abilities. Others didn't feel right emotionally. She was looking for something specific, though she couldn't quite name what it was. Then one evening she found it. Eric Satie's Jinapiti no Yi. It was a piece she had always loved but had rarely performed because it seemed too simple for a concert pianist. But now, with her changed circumstances and changed perspective, she heard it differently. The piece was about beauty and simplicity, about the spaces between notes being as important as the notes themselves. It required sensitivity and emotion more than technical virtuosity. Margaret began practicing it every day, slowly building up her endurance and reacquainting her hands with sustained playing. Some days were better than others. Some days her hands cooperated and the music flowed almost like it used to. Other days her fingers felt stiff and unresponsive, and she had to fight for every note. Emily noticed her mother spending more time at the piano at home. One Sunday afternoon, she sat down next to Margaret on the bench. "You're really going to do this, aren't you? You're going to perform at the gala." "I'm going to try," Margaret said. "I don't know if I can pull it off, but I'm going to try." "I'm proud of you, Mom. I know how hard this is." "I'm terrified," Margaret admitted. "What if I fail? What if I embarrass myself in front of all those people?" Emily took her mother's scarred hands in hers. "Then you fail. And you get back up and keep going. That's what you've taught me my whole life. You didn't raise me to be afraid of failure. You raised me to be brave enough to try." The words struck deep. Margaret realized that somewhere along the way she had lost sight of her own advice. She had let fear dictate her choices for 3 years, avoiding anything that might expose her vulnerability. But her students didn't see her as vulnerable. They saw her as strong, capable, inspiring. Maybe it was time she saw herself that way too. As the gala approached, word spread through Margaret's social circle that she would be performing. Most people were supportive, but she knew there would be skeptics. People who would come out of curiosity to see if she could still play, or worse, hoping to witness her failure. Linda Morrison called her a week before the gala. "Margaret, I heard you're playing at the Harrison fundraiser. How brave of you to put yourself out there like that. I'll definitely be there to support you." Margaret recognized the barely concealed condescension in Linda's voice. "I appreciate that, Linda. What are you playing?" "Something simple, I imagine, given the circumstances." "I'm playing Satie's Jimapiti No. 1, Margaret replied evenly. "Oh, how lovely. That's such a sweet little piece. Very appropriate for your situation." After the call ended, Margaret felt the familiar surge of anger and humiliation. Linda's words, seemingly supportive on the surface, were actually designed to diminish and patronize. But instead of letting it discourage her, Margaret used it as fuel. She would show Linda and everyone else who doubted her what she was still capable of. The day of the gala arrived. Margaret spent the morning practicing, then forced herself to rest in the afternoon. She couldn't afford to tire out her hands before the performance. Emily came over to help her get ready, bringing a beautiful navy blue dress that complemented Margaret's complexion perfectly. "You look stunning, Mom," Emily said as Margaret examined herself in the mirror. "I look terrified," Margaret corrected. "You look like someone about to do something incredibly brave." The gala was being held at the Harrison Mansion, the same venue where that fateful party had taken place 2 months earlier. As Margaret walked up the familiar stone pathway, she felt like she was stepping into a different version of herself, someone stronger and more determined than the woman who had hidden in corners at the last party. The mansion had been transformed for the event. The main room had been cleared and set up with rows of chairs facing the grand piano. Soft lighting created an intimate atmosphere, and flower arrangements filled the air with a delicate fragrance. People were already arriving, dressed in formal attire, mingling with champagne glasses in hand. Patricia Harrison greeted Margaret warmly. "You look wonderful. How are you feeling?" "Like I might throw up at any moment," Margaret said honestly. Patricia laughed. "That means you care." "That's good. Come, let me show you where you can wait until it's your turn." Margaret was led to a small sitting room off the main hallway. Several of her students were there with their parents, getting ready for their own performances. Jasmine ran up to her, eyes shining with excitement. "Miss Chun, I'm so nervous. Are you nervous too? Very nervous, Margaret admitted. But you're a professional. You've done this a million times. That was a long time ago, Jasmine. And even professionals get nervous. The key is to not let the nerves stop you from doing what you love. The program began promptly at 7. Margaret could hear Dr. Harrison welcoming the guests and explaining the purpose of the music center. Then Patricia spoke about the impact the program was already having on children in the community. Several of the Foundation's board members made brief remarks about the importance of arts education. Then it was time for the student performances. Margaret watched from the doorway as her beginners took the stage one by one, playing their simple pieces with varying degrees of confidence. Some stumbled through their songs, making mistakes but pushing forward. Others played with surprising poise. The audience was generous with their applause, clearly moved by the children's efforts. When Jasmine performed, Margaret felt a surge of pride. The young girl played a simplified version of Ar for Elise with genuine feeling, her small hands moving across the keys with growing confidence. She made a few mistakes, but she recovered quickly, just as Margaret had taught her. The applause was thunderous. After the student performances, there was a brief intermission. Margaret retreated to the sitting room, practicing deep breathing exercises to calm her racing heart. Her hands were shaking slightly, and she worried that she wouldn't be able to control them when the time came. Sophia appeared in the doorway. I heard you were performing tonight. I wouldn't miss it for the world. I'm glad you're here, Margaret said. I could use a friendly face in the audience. You're going to be wonderful. Remember what I told you at the party? Music is bigger than any one person's ambition. Tonight isn't about proving you're still the pianist you used to be. It's about sharing the music you love with people who will appreciate it. Patricia came to get Margaret shortly after. You're on in 5 minutes, ready? No, Margaret said, but she stood up anyway. She walked toward the main room, her legs feeling unsteady beneath her. Through the doorway, she could see the grand piano waiting for her, illuminated by a single spotlight. The audience was settling back into their seats, programs rustling, voices dropping to whispers. As Margaret approached the piano, she scanned the crowd. She saw Emily in the front row, her eyes bright with encouragement. She saw Sophia near the back, giving her a thumbs up. She saw her students and their parents all watching with anticipation. And yes, she saw Linda Morrison, sitting with several other members of their old social circle, her expression one of curious skepticism. Patricia made the introduction. Our final performer tonight is someone who needs no introduction to those familiar with classical piano. Margaret Chen was once one of the most celebrated concert pianists in the region. After a tragic accident 3 years ago, Margaret stepped away from performing. But recently, she has found a new calling as a teacher at our music center, inspiring the next generation of musicians. Tonight, she's returning to the stage to share her gift with us once more. Please welcome Margaret Chen. The applause was warm and welcoming. Margaret walked to the piano, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain everyone could hear it. She sat down on the bench, adjusting it to the right height, a motion so familiar it happened automatically. She placed her hands on her lap and took a deep breath, looking out at the sea of faces watching her. For a moment, panic threatened to overwhelm her. What was she doing here? She wasn't ready for this. She should never have agreed to perform. Her hands would fail her, she would humiliate herself, and everyone would see how far she had fallen. But then her eyes found Jasmine in the third row, sitting next to her parents. The little girl was leaning forward in her seat, her face filled with admiration and excitement. Margaret thought about what she had told her students countless times. Music isn't about being perfect. It's about expressing something real and true. Margaret lifted her hands and placed them on the keys. The cool ivory felt like coming home. She closed her eyes for a moment, not to shut out the audience but to center herself, to find the emotional core of the piece she was about to play. Then she began. The first notes of Gymnopédie No. 1 inch floated out into the room, soft and melancholic. Satie had written this piece to be played slowly, deliberately, with space for each note to breathe. It was the perfect choice for Margaret's current abilities. She didn't need speed or technical fireworks. She needed sensitivity, timing, and emotion. As Margaret played, something remarkable happened. The anxiety that had been gripping her began to dissolve. Her hands, which had felt stiff and uncertain moments before, began to move more freely. Yes, they ached a bit. Yes, there was a slight tremor in her left hand that hadn't been there 3 years ago. But they were doing what they needed to do. More importantly, Margaret realized she was feeling the music in a way she never had before. When she used to perform this piece years ago, it had been technically perfect but perhaps emotionally shallow. She had been young, successful, without any real understanding of loss or limitation. But now, playing it with hands that bore the scars of trauma, playing it as someone who had lost something precious and was finding a new way forward, the piece took on layers of meaning she had never accessed before. The simple melody became a meditation on acceptance, on finding beauty in imperfection, on the quiet dignity of moving forward despite everything. Each note seemed to carry weight, each pause felt intentional and necessary. Margaret wasn't just playing the piano, she was speaking her truth through it. In the audience, people who had come expecting a spectacle, either of triumph or failure, found themselves unexpectedly moved. The music was simple, yes, but it was also profound. It spoke to something universal about loss and resilience, about finding new purpose when old dreams die. Emily had tears streaming down her face, watching her mother reclaim something essential that she thought had been lost forever. Sophia was smiling, recognizing that Margaret had finally understood what she had tried to tell her at that first party. That her value as a musician wasn't determined by her technical abilities, but by her capacity to communicate genuine emotion through music. Even Linda Morrison, who had come prepared to offer condescending sympathy afterward, found herself unexpectedly touched. The music revealed something she hadn't expected, that Margaret's limitations had somehow deepened her artistry rather than diminished it. As Margaret played the final notes, letting them fade slowly into silence, the room remained still for several heartbeats. Then the applause began, and it was different from the polite appreciation given to the student performers earlier. This was genuine, moved, recognizing that they had witnessed something special. Margaret stood up from the piano bench, her legs still shaky but her heart full. She bowed slightly, acknowledging the applause, then walked back to her seat. Emily reached out and squeezed her hand as she passed, and Margaret squeezed back. After the formal program ended, people approached Margaret in waves. Some were old colleagues from her performing days, expressing their admiration not just for her playing but for her courage in returning to the stage. Others were parents of her students, thanking her for the gift she was giving their children. Several people asked if she would consider performing again, perhaps at other fundraising events or community concerts. But the most meaningful moment came from Jasmine, who pushed through the crowd of adults to reach her teacher. "Miss Chan, that was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard. When I grow up, I want to play like that. I want to make people feel things the way you just did." Margaret knelt down to the girl's level. "You will, Jasmine. You absolutely will. Just remember, it's not about playing perfectly. It's about playing honestly." Linda Morrison approached as the crowd began to thin. Margaret braced herself for whatever backhanded compliment was coming, but Linda surprised her. "Margaret, I owe you an apology," Linda said quietly. "I've been thoughtless and cruel, treating your situation as some kind of tragedy to be pitied. But watching you play tonight, I realized I had it all wrong. You haven't lost anything that matters. If anything, you've gained something deeper." Margaret was taken aback by the genuine humility in Linda's voice. "Thank you, Linda. That means a lot." "I mean it. The way you played tonight, it was different from before. More human somehow. More real." Linda paused, then continued, "I think maybe I was jealous. You had this amazing talent, and when you lost the ability to perform professionally, I thought it made us more equal somehow. But you've found a way to stay connected to your art that's actually more meaningful than just performing? That takes real strength." After Linda walked away, Patricia Harrison joined Margaret. "I can't thank you enough for doing this. You've given our fundraiser something truly special. We've raised twice what we hoped for tonight." "I'm glad I could contribute," Margaret said. "But honestly, Patricia, I think I got more out of this than anyone else. I've been so focused on what I lost that I couldn't see what I still had. Tonight reminded me why I fell in love with music in the first place." As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, Margaret stood alone in the main room once more, looking at the grand piano. But this time, She didn't see it as a reminder of her limitations. She saw it as a tool, a means of expression that would always be available to her even if the way she used it had changed. Emily came to collect her mother. Ready to go home? Actually, I was thinking I might stay a bit longer. There's something I want to discuss with Patricia about the music center. Emily smiled knowingly. You're going to expand your teaching, aren't you? I'm thinking about it. Maybe adding some master classes for more advanced students. Maybe even starting a program for adults who always wanted to learn piano but never had the chance. There's so much I could do. Margaret did stay longer, and by the time she left the Harrison mansion that night, she had agreed to double her teaching hours at the music center and to develop a new program for adult beginners. She had also tentatively agreed to perform at 2 more fundraising events over the coming year. In the car on the way home, Emily asked her mother how she felt. Exhausted, Margaret admitted. My hands are aching. I'll probably need to ice them for an hour when we get home. But also alive. For the first time in 3 years, I feel like I have a purpose again. Not the same purpose I had before, but maybe a better one. Teaching, sharing music with people who genuinely want to learn, performing in settings where perfection isn't the goal. It feels more authentic somehow. Over the following months, Margaret's life transformed in ways she never expected. Her classes at the music center grew, and she became known as an exceptional teacher who understood not just the technical aspects of piano, but the emotional and artistic dimensions as well. Her students thrived under her guidance, and several went on to win regional competitions. She began performing regularly at small, intimate venues, charity events, community concerts, even occasional performances at the music center for students and parents. She never tried to recapture her former glory as a concert pianist. Instead, she carved out a new identity as a teaching artist who occasionally shared her gift through performance. Sophia became a regular visitor, often sitting in on Margaret's classes to learn teaching techniques. The 2 women developed a close friendship, bonded by their shared love of music and their understanding that success in music could take many forms. Margaret even reconnected with some of her old colleagues from the conservatory. When they invited her to give a guest lecture to their students about musicality and expression, she accepted. Standing in front of the same classroom where she used to teach technique and theory, she now taught something deeper: how to find meaning in music even when life doesn't go according to plan. 1 year after that fateful evening party, Margaret received an invitation to another Harrison summer gathering. This time when she arrived, she felt no anxiety, no need to hide. She moved through the crowd with confidence, greeting old friends and making new acquaintances. When Dr. Harrison inevitably asked if anyone wanted to play the piano, several people looked at Margaret expectantly. She smiled and shook her head. Not tonight. I'm quite content to listen. And she was content, truly content, in a way she hadn't been even at the height of her performing career.